voluntary sustainability standards in trade agreements, charting a path for sustainable trade. I'm Joshua Wickerham, the Outreach and Engagement Manager at ISEAL. ISEAL is the global membership organization for sustainability systems and related sustainability standards. We are very grateful for the Swiss Secretariat for Economic Cooperation, SECO, for supporting this work. And we're really looking forward to an exciting webinar today with great speakers from private sector, from the government of Colombia, from the Swiss government, UN Trade and Development, the WTO, and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And it will be a very interactive session. We will be using a tool called Easy Retro, where you can share your identified challenges and solutions to the questions we're discussing today. And there will be a Q&A function that you can submit questions to our wonderful panelists. Really grateful for the collaboration with IISD. On a personal note, my very first research project almost 20 years ago was with IISD on sustainable trade, and it's amazing to see the progress we've made. So next slide, please. A little about the agenda. After my welcome remarks, we will have a panel discussion about, we will have a presentation from IISD on some exciting research they've done on VSS and trade policy, the focus on free trade agreements, VSS being voluntary sustainability standards or voluntary sustainability systems. So an overview of the different ways that VSSs can be integrated into trade policy, and a zoom in on VSS integration in FTAs. Then we'll have a moderated discussion with our guest speakers, discussing why VSS are referenced in free trade agreements, and also how has the integration played out in practice? What are we learning from this? And then we'll have discussion of the way forward and next steps. And throughout all of this, you can submit questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. And then I'll do some closing remarks. Next slide, please. A little about ISEAL. We're a little over 20 years old. We're a charity based in London, and we're known for our definition of good practice for sustainability systems. And there are two relevant tools that ISEAL uses that are useful in this trade discussion today. So the first is one we call the ISEAL credibility principles, which is a globally consulted set of principles that helps VSS identify the attributes that make them more credible and impactful. It's also a tool for businesses, governments, civil society, other users of VSS to understand what they can expect a credible sustainability system to deliver. And this delivers really on ISEAL's mission of supporting and challenging VSS to improve their practices. We work with hundreds of VSS in many dozens of sectors around the world to improve their impacts. And we work with partners to make sure there's good knowledge and a smart mix of regulation and voluntary mechanisms to achieve ISEAL's mission of shaping a world where markets are a force for good, where production and consumption and resource management and trade benefit everyone. So trade is really at the heart of what ISEAL does. And if we look at the credibility principles in a little more detail, we can see where they align to some of the WTO principles. For example, value creation on the bottom right, that's very aligned to the idea of the development dimension. A sustainability system should be creating value for all the users of the system. Stakeholder engagement is aligned to impartiality and consensus and the coherence and openness of the development of the VSS. Transparency is directly related to the WTO, one of the WTO 6 principles. And collaboration with many different stakeholders makes VSS more than a sum of their parts. Next slide, please. The other relevant ISEAL credibility tool that's useful in this discussion is the ISEAL Code of Good Practice for Sustainability Systems. And this is a normative reference, meaning that it can be audited. You can say which standards meet this code and which do not. So it's a globally recognized framework for defining practices for effective and credible VSS. And again, it's based on the WTO principles and disciplines from the very beginning. the standard setting requirements are very much aligned to what the WTO TBT Annex 3 and other WTO requirements codify. So it's a codified document. It's also, these two tools are very helpful for trade policy. They're increasingly referenced in public procurement or other policies that affect sustainable trade. And the credibility principles, especially, can be useful when governments or others are considering which kinds of VSS should be considered in FTAs or in trade policy, especially if there's any preferential treatments being applied for sustainability goals. And now over to IISD colleagues.
Thank you, Joshua. So just to briefly introduce IISD and IISD State of Sustainability Initiatives, IISD is a Canadian award-winning independent think tank with the mission to accelerate solutions for a stable climate, sustainable resources, and fair economies. Within IISD, we have the IISD States of Sustainability Initiatives, and since 2008, we've been advancing sustainable and inclusive value chains. We do so by providing evidence-based impartial analysis, clear and actionable recommendations, and we convene multiple actors being an influential voice in the field. With that being said, I hand over to my colleague Stephanie for the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Flor. I'm Stephanie Bermudez. I'm a policy advisor at the ISD, and today with my colleague Florencia, we will dive into different ways on how voluntary sustainability standards are being integrated into trade policy based on ISD research. Next slide, please. So first, voluntary sustainability standards are market-based systems that prescribe social, economic, and environmental requirements for voluntary compliance by producers and other economic actors to enhance sustainability in production and processing. They operate in various sectors, as you might know, including agriculture, textiles, mining, and others. And they have processes in place to ensure that responsible practices or sustainability performance levels that they defined are assessed, measured, and communicated. So over the past decades, governments have increasingly incorporated voluntary sustainability standards or systems, VSS, in trade policy instruments to address environmental, social, and economic issues in commodity production and trade. And next slide, please. So our research shows that these standards are integrated into unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral measures and are being referenced following different intentions. Cooperation and promotion, other actors are using them to support the implementation of trade instruments or to develop guidelines for its development. Some common concerns under integration across policy instruments are the cost for producers and operators and the effectiveness of their assurance mechanisms. But we will discuss these and other challenges during the presentation. So next slide, please. These are the policy instruments where we found references to voluntary sustainability standards in trade policy. I will focus on the first three: market access regulations, export promotion, and government procurement. Sorry, so for the market access, and Florencia will focus on the free trade agreements. Next slide, please. So for access market regulations, we found that VSS are being used in regulations that establish the conditions for the entry of a specific goods or products into markets. Some examples of these are the Korea's Act on the Sustainable Use of Timbers, which explicitly mentions voluntary sustainability standards, as it requires that timber or timber products entering their market are compliant with some VSS, such as the Forest Stewardship Council or the PEFC, and compliance is verified by the inspection agency at the point of entry through forest management or product certificates or other relevant certificates. The European Union timber regulation in their Article 6 is another example of integration of VSS in an implicit way. This regulation specifies that operators need to develop a risk assessment exercise to minimize the risk of placing illegally harvested timber in the European market. And this should include the origin of the timber and other criteria, and ensure compliance with applicable legislation, potentially through certification or third-party verified schemes. Some opportunities and challenges of this integration, next slide please, include, of course, the incentive for more VSS adoption and the potential improvement in their design and assurance mechanisms that can lead to greater recognition and potential alignment with public policy. Some challenges include aligning standard criteria with the regulatory sustainability requirements, which might be complex and time-consuming, but this requires close coordination between governments and standard-setting bodies by, for instance, developing information sharing mechanisms or audit report review, and the government's oversight or monitoring on the procedures and practices implemented by VSS after their recognition as proof of compliance, to ensure that they are still aligned with the intended objectives of their inclusion. Next slide, please. So as for export promotion, we see that countries are increasingly looking to access markets by making compliance with one or different voluntary sustainability standards necessary to producers and exporters, and in some cases compliance with the specific standards are necessary to obtain export licenses or permit operations. And examples of these includes Mozambique, which partnered with the Better Cotton Initiative to embed the standards principle and criteria in national regulations to boost sustainable cotton exports. And this resulted in the development of a national standard for cotton following the criteria and indicators of the BCI, and the provision of tech training and technical assistance for cotton farmers in the country. And another interesting example is that one in the Kenyan flower sector, where cut flowers and ornamental producers and operators are required compliance with the Kenyan Flower Council FOSS standard or with the public standard, the Kenya Standard 1758, to obtain export licenses. So this is an interesting example of benchmarking between public and private standards for export promotion. Some opportunities, next slide please, and challenges of this inclusion. I will start with the opportunities that the recognition of voluntary sustainability standards can work as an indicator of compliance with sustainable practices to access key export markets, and as a tool that can help also to design or inform legislation. VSS can also act as a mechanism that can push key industries towards more sustainable practices and comply with other quality and safety measures, granting access not only to export markets, but also enhancing regional and domestic markets. Despite these, some challenges exist in their integration, including the risk of transforming a voluntary instrument into a legal requirement, potentially excluding farmers or small and medium enterprises from accessing markets. And also we found that there is a lack of consolidated data on the number and nature of measures that integrate the standards, voluntary sustainability standards, in export promotion measures. So this is a challenge that we come across the policy instruments that we analyzed. And next slide, please. We also found that countries are referencing voluntary sustainability standards in public procurement. And examples include the Republic of Korea, Mexico, and Peru. In Korea, the state agencies should give preference to, in tenders to products that comply with the Korea Eco label in articles like the office equipment and construction materials. And in Mexico and Peru, VSS are being used to grant additional points to tenders that show compliance with the standards, such as the FSC or PEFC, to identify sustainable timber or wood products or furniture that is made with this wood. So this is important because public procurement accounts for about 15% of the GDP across low, middle, and high income countries. So this signals an opportunity for VSS to being used as a proxy indicators of positive and environmental performance, and for governments to create demand for more sustainable products and promote also sustainable consumption at the institutional level. VSS also have the potential to be used as guidelines to ensure that public contracts contribute to reach sustainable goals, and can serve potentially as mechanisms that governments can use to verify the social sustainability and sustainable practices of a supplier's goods or services. However, for VSS to be used as proof of compliance within sustainable public procurement, there is need for a clear and strong legal framework, along with training procurement staff on how VSS work, and as well as a well-functioning support infrastructure that includes laboratories or technical standards and clear auditing procedures. So I think that's it for the first three instruments. And now I will give the floor to my colleague Florencia for assuming in FTAs.
Thank you, Stephanie. Next slide, please. So having done the analysis of the different policy measures that Steph just mentioned, we focus on FTAs, given the stark increase that we observed in the past years of VSS incorporation. Now, during this short presentation, I will cover the main findings of our research that we will then discuss with our speakers. Next slide, please. How many FTAs reference VSS? As you can see in the slide, before 2018, there were only 17 FTAs referring to VSS. But then looking at the analyzed agreements from 2018 to 2023, we found that 29 out of the 61 agreements refer to VSS in some way. Next slide, please. In terms of how they are actually referenced, we found that there are 37 different ways of referencing VSS, of terms used. Examples include eco-labeling, incentive-based mechanisms, voluntary mechanisms, and the others that you can see in the slide. But there is also a variation in the terms of the use of VSS. And based on text analysis, we identify 5 different cases. The first one is VSS as an area of cooperation. Parties may agree to cooperate on VSS, sometimes listing them as an area of cooperation or by including exchange of information. Some agreements also include exchange of information in terms of efficiency of implementation of these mechanisms. There is also promotion. Parties may state that they will facilitate and promote trade in sustainable products, including those that are certified. And this is sometimes found in relationship with specific issues, such as deforestation. There is also recognition. The parties may state and recognize that VSS can contribute to the achievement and maintenance of high levels of environmental protection, and sometimes also notably stating that they can complement national regulatory measures. Another interesting case to use is guidelines, where the parties state that they should encourage the private sector to develop mechanisms that are truthful and not misleading, based on international standards, good practices, and guidelines. And the last example of a case used that we found is VSS as a tool to support the implementation of the FTA. There's only one example in an FTA, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, is the EFTA Indonesia, where Switzerland, in implementing the agreement in domestic legislation, states that palm oil imported from Indonesia, in order to access market with preferential tariff treatment, needs to comply with one of the specified certifications that includes RSPO, ISEC Plus, and POIG. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over the examples of text. You can see them afterwards when we upload the slides, or you can have a look at the insight that it's available online. But having viewed these different types of incorporation, we wanted to hear your thoughts on, and I'm going to launch a poll question, on what you think of these 5 different case uses, which of these approaches you think holds more promise to drive sustainable trade? And we're going to discuss some of these during the discussion with the speakers, and perhaps you will confirm your thoughts or you will change your mind. But we wanted to hear from you at this stage. I'm going to give you some time to vote. So we have cooperation, promotion of certified goods, recognition of VSS as a tool, specific guidelines on how this voluntary sustainability standards should be developed, or VSS to support the implementation of the FTA. Perhaps we can close the poll now and see the results. So recognition is one of the most voted examples, followed by cooperation. This is super interesting. We're going to discuss some of these case uses during the discussion with the speakers. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat that we can take over during the Q&A. Thank you very much for your insights. Now, next slide, please. Let me now turn to the issues that need to be addressed. We identified in our analysis 5 issues related to the recognition and incorporation of VSS in FTA that need to be addressed in order to maximize their benefits. The first one is ambiguity. As I mentioned before, there are different terms used to refer to VSS, and this may result in a lack of clarity about the scope of such provisions. To address this, perhaps standardized definitions or advocating for universally accepted terms will help address the issue in future agreements. We have also observed a lack of enforcement mechanisms in these provisions, because normally the provisions are rather vague or just promotional, and they lack enforceable mechanisms, which then limits the implementation, and this can hinder both the potential impacts and the possibility to assess their effects. We did not find any information on how these provisions played out in practice after the conclusion of the FTA. There is also a widely recognized challenge that is the potential for VSS to become barriers to trade. While VSS are voluntary in nature, their increased use and reference in trade policy and in FTAs may make them a de facto requirement for market access that can pose challenges for producers and small and medium enterprises, particularly in developing countries. And this could be perhaps addressed by including provisions in the FTAs about the preference in using those standards that have in place mechanisms to facilitate compliance by small-scale producers. And this could be training opportunities, supporting services, access to funds, among others. Another issue that we have identified is that there is a lack of guidance on how to use VSS in trade policy and also which VSS should be used. Here, it would be helpful to assess whether governments would find it useful to develop a set of minimum requirements that standards need to meet in order to be formally used in trade policy. And this can be related to the design, considering transparency and credibility, among others, as well as guidelines on how to specifically integrate them in trade policy. And this is linked with the last issue that we have identified, which is credibility. The fact that we see references of VSS in trade policy in FTAs does not automatically ensure their credibility or effectiveness in advancing sustainable outcomes. VSS are all different, and some tools, such as the ISEAL credibility code principles that were mentioned by Joshua in the beginning, or the ISO 14000 family of standards, could be used for these purposes. Next slide. But despite the challenges or the issues of concern, we also put forward 3 main benefits and opportunities that can be opened by including VSS in FTAs. The first one is that VSS can act as supporting tools for fostering sustainable trade. They can be seen as a complementary mechanism for reinforcing public regulations. And as shown by Steph, it's not only limited to FTAs, there are also other trade-related policy measures that have leverage on VSS. And there have been increasingly discussions on how VSS could support the implementation of due diligence or green claims regulations. There's also an opportunity to drive innovative approaches in trade policy. I've mentioned, for instance, the FTA Indonesia example, where VSS are being used for the first time to qualify palm oil products that meet certain sustainability requirements for preferential tariff treatment. And this practice could establish a regulatory precedent to develop tariff preferences for products that meet sustainability criteria. But all in all, we believe that there is an opportunity for greater cooperation between policymakers and VSS organizations that can improve the design of VSS and strengthen how they are implemented in trade policy to achieve and promote sustainable trade. And just to conclude now, the increase in VSS reference in FTAs over the recent year has taken place within a broader trend of addressing environmental and social concerns in trade policy. This integration just highlights the role that VSS can play in advancing more sustainable trade practices. The use of VSS in trade policy shows a great potential to drive sustainable practices for various reasons. For instance, VSS organizations drive and bring together a wide array of actors such as civil society groups, private sectors, in some cases public actors, for more inclusion in trade. And they offer valuable on-the-ground experience in supporting producers and communities, and can provide also a link to technical and financial support to help producers and communities transition to more sustainable and inclusive practices. However, it should be noted that the impact of this inclusion is still uncertain, and it's too early to determine whether the growing inclusion of VSS in FTAs will lead to more sustainable trade among the parties that have signed the agreement. We need further evidence. We need a deeper level of analysis to better understand how these provisions have played out in practice and what are the concrete effects on ground. But in sum, what we see is that the trend of referencing VSS in FTAs open up opportunities to strengthen VSS, increase our understanding about them, address their shortcomings, distinguishing credible systems from low-performing ones. And at the same time, it's an opportunity to integrate existing VSS knowledge and practices into the development and implementation of FTAs to address critical sustainability issues. With that, I conclude, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Florencia and Stephanie. Fascinating research. And I want to highlight a tool that we're using to get your opinions about the challenges and opportunities for using VSS in FTAs. You can scan this QR code, or you can use the link that I put in the chat to share the challenges. What are the biggest challenges for using VSS in trade policy? Are there any barriers that need to be overcome? You just click on the plus sign under the question, and then when other people put answers, you can vote up their answers. The other question is about the opportunities for using VSS in trade policy. And I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And now, Florencia, back to you for a panel discussion.
Thank you, Joshua. I think that we can turn off the slides now. Perfect. And I'll give the floor to Steph.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Flor. So now let's move to our first panel of questions with guest speakers, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dominic. He is an advisor. He works in the Free Trade Agreements FTA division at Switzerland State of Secretariat for Economic Affairs, ECO. He is part of the team in charge of negotiating and implementing trade and sustainable development provisions in Switzerland FTAs, including the FTA Indonesia. We also have Manuel, Chacon. He is the Director of Commercial Relations at the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Tourism of Colombia. And he's in charge of economic relations with different regions, North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, including the administration of the trade agreements that Colombia has with the countries of those regions. And we also have Cameron Pleesh. He is Head of Government Affairs for North America and Europe. For the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO. And Cameron has extensive experience in international environmental policy across 4 continents with various organizations. And later we will have Mario Abreu. He's head of the group for CSR and sustainability at Ferrero. And he leads Ferrero's sustainability work since, hi Mario, since 2020. And he has had board roles in different voluntary sustainability standards, such as the FSC, the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, the ProForest Initiative, and currently an alternate member of the RSPO board. So the first set of questions will be related to the objectives or the rationale, motivation on the integration of voluntary sustainability standards in FTAs. And I would like to start with Dominic, asking you, what is the primary objective of Switzerland's use of voluntary sustainability standards to support the implementation of the EFTA Indonesia agreement? And what motivated Switzerland to require compliance with these specific standards for traded vegetable oils and derivatives under the agreement?
Thank you very much, Stephanie, Florencia, for this introduction and for your question. I'm very happy to be here and to share our experience with this new innovative solution that we found in our FTA with Indonesia. And maybe before answering questions, I would like to give you a little bit of context just to understand a bit, how we arrived at this solution. We didn't go into the negotiations in Indonesia with this solution already in mind, but it was actually quite a long process in arriving at this solution. So palm oil, and of course this solution is about vegetable oils in general, but palm oil in particular, was quite a controversial topic in these negotiations, or at least a widely discussed topics with Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia is the world's biggest palm oil producer, and any FTA that would not include any concessions on palm oil is understandably quite difficult for them to accept. At the same time, palm oil is maybe one of the most controversially discussed products in Switzerland by consumers because of sustainability concerns. It's also considered by some here in Switzerland as competition, as entering the competition with domestic vegetable oils like sunflower and rapeseed oil. So there was quite some resistance in Switzerland to granting any concessions for palm oil in the agreement with Indonesia. So that was a bit the tension, the 2 positions we tried to bridge in our negotiations. So what we did is we agreed on some limited concessions, tariff concessions, tariff preferences for Indonesian palm oil, but we linked them as well to a number of conditions regarding sustainable production. So there's an article in the TSD chapter, in the chapter on trade and sustainable development, on the sustainable management of the vegetable oil sector, where we have a whole list of sustainability criteria that we commit to on both sides, on the EFTA and the Indonesia side, and we linked the respective these criteria to the tariff preferences we granted for palm oil. Now, this is the setup, the framework we have in the agreement. But now, of course, the question was how to implement this at the border. How to check that these conditions are respected. And here, I think what we were looking for was a solution that was credible on the one hand, so to show to our domestic stakeholders, that this is not just words on paper and some commitments that we never follow up on, but that we actually checking that these sustainability requirements are respected and are met. But at the same time, of course, the solution had to be not too burdensome for importers or exporters, in order not to de facto nullify the preference we have granted under the agreement, because that would obviously be in bad faith. So we had to be practical and credible at the same time. So we looked at the range of options starting, with just trusting our importers that they would respect the criteria together with their partners in Indonesia on the one end of the range, and then on the other end, requiring documentary evidence that all the exporters and importers would have to submit to us and that we would look into. But both solutions were not really satisfactory. What we ended up with was this approach based on voluntary sustainability standards. So we conducted a benchmarking exercise, benchmarking the existing standards, and there's quite a few for palm oil, luckily. We benchmarked against the criteria that we defined in the agreement, sustainability criteria, and we ended up with a number of them, 4 standards that met this criteria, and that then we recognize in a federal ordinance as sufficient proof that the sustainability criteria are met. So with this solution, we consider that both criteria, credibility and practicability, are met, because these standards, if you take as one example RSPO, which is maybe the widely known standard in this field, is first of all widely used among Swiss importers. So it's not something that something that they know, that they have worked with for a long time. And is also Indonesia is also the world's biggest producer of RSPO certified palm oil. So it was not some kind of restriction that would nullify the preference on the Indonesian side. So I think that's how we arrived at the solution. So credibility, practicability, and here I think voluntary sustainability standards can play a role. Of course, it's not easy to copy that from the palm oil context to other products, but for the palm oil question in the Indonesia after context, I think it was the best solution that we found. And I think by creating this, sorry, last sentence, and then by creating this positive incentive, by giving additional preferences for sustainable palm oil, I think it's also an important symbol to Indonesia to continue their efforts towards sustainable production of palm oil. Now I'm done.
Thank you, Dominique. Yeah, it is indeed an innovative approach, and we will have the opportunity to learn more on the implementation during the second set of questions. But yeah, I think the motivations, as you mentioned, credibility and practicability were the main motivations behind the inclusion of these standards in the agreement. So now I would like to move to Colombia for asking Manuel on the promotion and cooperation, how standards are being used for these purposes. So my question will be, what motivated the parties to include provisions encouraging the development and the use of these standards for promoting sustainability in the EC Colombia, Peru, Ecuador trade agreement, and what motivated the parties to reference voluntary mechanisms within the agreement?
Thank you very much. And I would like also to begin by thanking the IISD for inviting me to this seminar. I think it's a very useful topic at the moment. And I think it couldn't be more in time to have this kind of discussions. I also have to begin by saying that maybe the analysis, well, it was a photography of our previous policy, Colombia's policy regarding sustainability and sustainable trade has changed in the recent years. So the examples that we have were like from around 10 years ago, but we are renewing our FTAs. We are increasing the participation regarding sustainability, and we hope to see something, actually, some of the distillation, the ideas distilled from this seminar into our futures FTA. To be honest, to be completely and fully honest with all of you, what motivated the inclusion of VSS in our previous agreement was because of other parties' request. Let's begin by there. Because at the moment when we negotiated those agreements, we were more like in a traditional approach to the international trade obligations. We focus on more, let's say, cold trade commitments. And just at the moment, just around 10 years ago, we began this trend towards more sustainability. If you see the context of the agreements where we include These two of these obligations are the agreement with the European Union, the agreement with Korea, were more or less at the same time. Well, the agreement with the European Union was ended the negotiation around more than 10 years ago, and it is in force around 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. And at that moment, we also began this trend towards becoming part of the OECD. And in that sense, all of our policies regarding sustainability were had a boost, let's say. We began incorporating this kind of obligations and this kind of commitments, not only in our FTAs, but also in our more, let's say, our internal policy regarding production. Colombia has always been a very eco-friendly country. We have many laws regarding protection of the environment, but translating those laws into actual international obligations have always been a challenge. So these obligations that we agreed in European Union trade agreement and the Korean agreement, if you see, they focus in basically two issues. And I'm really glad about the previous presentation because it can be tagged easily for the audience. First of all, cooperation. We definitely saw that we require a lot of cooperation in implementing this kind of obligation and this kind of VSS for the private sector. And in second term, but let's say with less strength in encouragement, in how to encourage more sustainable production from some of the crops. If you evaluate where these obligations are, they are precisely in these two chapters, in a chapter regarding cooperation and a chapter regarding sustainable trade. And that is important because of those two issues. In cooperation, of course, as I told you, that is part of our how can we approach these kind of obligations, and we go to our partners to help us understand and implement this kind of commitments. And the second, in sustainable trade, because that was an area where we understood that there were more involvement, more participation from the private sector. And in the administration of this agreement, particularly in the agreement with the European Union, we have seen each year more involvement by the private sector, particularly in this chapter. These sustainability commitments, let's say voluntary commitments regarding VSS, voluntary sustainability standards, have become each year more important. And I think that what the previous speaker said about the interest of the markets to ensure the sustainability of their imports have also, of course, become increasingly, let's say, not before was a clamor. Now is like the minimum for the crops to arrive to other countries. And I have to say this because you know that at the beginning there were voluntary standards, but as the presentation said, they yearly have become more like mandatory to arrive to other countries. And I have to refer to the European Union Green Deal and the voluntarily, let's say, well, the different aspect of that guidelines that eventually, well, actually will create some conditions that you have to comply only to be able to arrive. In the 10 years, I will finish, I know I'm going to, let me finish with two things. The first of all is about the actual enforcement and administration of the obligations. And I have to say that there is a huge vacuum. As you mentioned in the presentation, in the relation between governments, the implementation of these obligations have been quite buoyant. We just had a 10-year anniversary of the implementation of the agreement with the European Union last year. And we're reviewing the obligations. This was something that was kind of messy because there are no enforcement mechanisms for the obligations. And the second is that the voluntary standards have become more important for the industry And I have to say this because as an example, the obligations of sustainability in trade have become more and more mandatory. I will focus that on the second set of questions. But let's say that we have to comply, that some of our crops can arrive to the European market. And 3 weeks ago, we finally made our first 2 containers of premium coffees arrive to the European market, having complied with all the standards that are implemented at the moment. And that was because of the use of voluntary, sustainable standard, particularly, and I have to say this, I'm sorry, but the Rainforest Alliance, which using that the producers were able to prove that they complied with all the due diligence and all the sustainability requirements that were necessary to access the European market. So I will stop this because I know that I already passed my time, but I have to say that now is more important, these voluntary standards from the part of the producers, and the idea of cooperation in the free trade agreements as a let's say as commitments regarding cooperation as a tool to promote this use. I will say it will get stronger as the time comes by. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you. So I think it's clear that the motivations or following this trend that we also see in our research, and the desire to encourage a sustainable production and accessing markets in key consuming countries. But as you said, the challenges on the enforcement are important, and we will discuss this in the second set of questions. So Cameron, I want to hear your reaction on these 2 examples that we discussed. As you see, the incorporation of the standards in free trade agreements has spiked in the past few years. So why do you think this has happened? Have you seen that this integration has had any effects on increasing standard compliant practices? And if so, which are these effects on the countries or the producers and the environment?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, first of all, and thank you, IISD and ISEAL, for putting this together, and as well for Dominic and Manuel for your comments. Especially thank you, Dominic, for Switzerland for explicitly mentioning the RSPO. Thanks for name dropping us in your FTA. Yeah, great question, Stephanie. It's a little bit too early to tell in a lot of ways, specifically thinking of the Switzerland and Indonesia FTA. It's still relatively early on. We're still assessing whether we've seen direct impacts or increases. It's also important to note that Switzerland is a relatively small player when it comes to palm oil. No disrespect to Switzerland at all, but as far as imports, it's about 20,000 metric tons of palm oil per year going into Switzerland. So this is still very important. Switzerland has always demanded pretty high standards for their imports. And have always been a pretty big player in RSPO segregated and identity preserved supply chains, which is what is stipulated in the free trade agreement. So to me, one of the most helpful things with that example specifically is that across the entire supply chain, no matter which VSS you're talking about, certification costs money for the producers, for the middle of the supply chain, for the importers, and for the manufacturers within countries that are bringing those products in. So having these free trade agreements that give incentives can help to reduce that cost barrier for all actors across the supply chain. So that is something that we believe will be the result of this free trade agreement between Switzerland and Indonesia, and why we certainly encourage things like this for other countries looking to free trade agreements. It's something that will be a priority of ours going forward, is helping to promote this, and something I think is a benefit for all VSS around the world in all countries and regions. I do think there is a direct impact on the environment long term. Again, still early to see exactly how this has correlated with it. But again, the main reason why is that free trade agreements in principle are meant to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And it does create that opportunity to help producers and all other supply chain actors to have that added incentive. Again, none of this comes for free. The importing countries want to do this for various reasons, whether it's meeting their NDCs, just reducing their footprint in general and trying to play a positive role. But VSS offers the opportunity to do it in a more collaborative way, For the RSPO as an example, we have about 6,000 members around the world that are joining our partnership to make palm oil sustainable. We're in over 100 countries and territories around the world as well. So to the comments earlier, the surveys about recognition and cooperation, VSS helps to offer that common language, a common framework. Also, we are already operating in a lot of countries around the world, working directly with producers and working across the supply chain. So we are able to help connect all those actors, create that common framework, something that governments can build off of to make sure that the impact is finding its way all the way to the communities and producers who are ultimately the most important players in this conversation. So without making sure that the producers and the farmers and the communities are at the heart of all of this, honestly, you're not going to see the impact that you are desiring. And VSS offers a great opportunity for everybody to be able to do that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. So Flor, I will let you.
Yes. Well, thank you all for these very interesting insights. I think it's interesting to see how in some cases it's more the public or civil society that drives this inclusion of VSS as a solution that is credible and both practical for the government. And then as mentioned by Manuel, sometimes it's the counterparty that brings that into the table. But then in the past years, this has become a global trend of including sustainability, as we mentioned also in the presentation, that just this incorporation is part of a global trend of addressing sustainability issues in FTAs. And Manuel, you mentioned something that gives me now a nice segue to the second part of the presentation, apart from what you mentioned, Cameron, on the need to have producers and everybody on the table, which is key. That is that increasingly we have the private sector involved in this and pushing for this. So with that, now we're going to focus more on implementation. And I want to start by asking Mario from Ferrero about what does this mean, or what do you see as from a private sector perspective? What are the challenges and opportunities associated with this integration, and what effect does it have on business operations?
Vanessa, thanks for inviting me. I hope you hear me well. I'm sorry, I'm in a bit of a noisy place, so I hope it doesn't bother too much. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think we welcome very much the idea of implementing credibility in regards to traceability in supply chains, prevention of deforestation, defense of human rights. And I think, of course, the VSS, they have been there for so many years. They bring a lot of experience. They bring a lot of common knowledge and common experiences and competence in regards to implementing the systems. I have, however, been in this world for quite long. I joined the board of FSC back in 2006. And for me, the major question is a lot of the businesses, they have been looking at the VSS as a means to add credibility to their programs. And the credibility were coming from this very delicate balance of social, environmental, and economic drivers, always kind of trying to find a common approach to things. And I see that there is an open door there for the VSS to be perhaps less less voluntary somehow, and more something that helps companies implementing compliance. So the challenge for me is sort of a potential identity crisis of the VSS. In a way, because we got used to seeing perhaps companies that wanted to take a leadership role to apply some of the standards, RSPO, FSC, many of them, and that created some sort of a differentiation in the market. So we were investing in these certification schemes because of the credibility, the extra credibility offered. Now, the regulation makes a level playing field, which, don't get me wrong, is very welcome. I guess the question is, would the VSS be then adding on credibility somehow? Or would the VSS no longer play that extra credibility role, so we are all on the same level playing field, which is not a bad thing, maybe just throwing silly numbers, but maybe 20% of the forest volumes or palm oil volumes were certified as being sustainable by the sustainability standards. Maybe in the future, we're going to see 80% being certified according to them, but mostly from the perspective of complying with the regulations. So are we going to be able to maintain some degree of differentiation, extra value from the VSS? I don't have the answer for that, but so if I look back at our own operations, of course, there is a huge advantage. We have, if I take palm oil, we have already implemented traceability. We have segregated palm oil certified by our SPO at about 100%. So that puts in a very good position for us to comply with EUGR, and any FTA is super welcome for that. So don't get me wrong, we're very happy about it. My question is on the other side, are we going to continue pursuing some sort of a differentiation, or are we going to be happy with a level playing field where I would say the most important social and environmental conditions have been addressed, and everybody is playing on a better game than we used to as a whole, as the entire market.
Thank you very much. I think that you raised, key issues, no? The using VSS, the credibility, but then also the credibility issue of VSS, and how there will be an identity crisis, because we are seeing this trend toward voluntary. The name voluntary sustainability mechanisms, but they are becoming more and more mandatory.
If I can add, Florence, I just came to my mind many years ago. There was a book published by Professor Benjamin Kishore and other people, other professors from Yale, called Governing Through Markets, advocating that the birthplace of the voluntary standards was the lack of formal governance, making stakeholders embedding sustainability criteria, social and environmental criteria in their sourcing. So VSS was the non-governmental response to improve the markets. And now we're talking about VSS as an instrument to secure compliance and regulation. So I think there's a big transformation there. And I think this is where the dynamics are so interesting for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and also because we see, VSS have developed in parallel from public regulation, and now we see increasingly these synergies. It's just a matter of seeing how they will play out in practice and how we ensure that nobody is left behind because of the cost and the credibility concerns. But thank you very much for your points. I would like now to turn to Dominic, and then I'll ask you, Cameron, to answer a question, but this will be related to the FTA Indonesia agreement, of course. So we want to ask you, how has the use of VSS as a requirement for access to preferential tariff treatment translated into practice in terms of at the border for businesses, customs officer? Do you have any indicators on how it has been played out in practice, or any lessons learned from this?
Yes, thank you for this follow-up questions. I would say it's a bit early to draw any lessons or follow-up lessons from the implementation of SEPA. So far we haven't seen really an uptick in palm oil imports from Indonesia under the agreement. So this is not news. It's not as such a surprise, because as Cameron rightly pointed out, the palm oil market in Switzerland is actually quite small, and it's decreasing because also of the controversy around palm oil among Swiss consumers. So we have seen a decrease in overall imports of palm oil over the last 10 years, I would say. And the fewer palm oil importers there are in Switzerland, actually they have self-committed to using only certified palm oil, to only import certified palm oil into Switzerland, and they have, for the major part, long-standing relationships with their suppliers, which are not necessarily in Indonesia. So I think we couldn't expect an immediate uptake or change of supply chains towards Indonesia now, these 2.5 years after entering into force. So we haven't seen many imports from Indonesia so far, but you still expect that given time, this will change, and the companies will take up the preferential treatment they get under SEPA. But we have, of course, still worked on how to implement this at the border. So we have actually set this out, the whole system, how this works in a federal ordinance, which is a regulation adopted by government, where we have listed the standards we recognize, and we've also listed the whole procedure, how this works. So each importer who wants to import palm oil under the Indonesia FTA has first to ask for authorization to me, actually. So he has to send a request to me, just proving that they are certified according to one of the standards you recognize in the ordinance. And then they get an authorization. And then for each import, they have to be able to show for the whole supply chain that all elements, all actors in the supply chain are certified according to the same standard. And so they have to be able to provide documentary proof of that. That customs officer can check at the moment of importation or during the 5 years following importation. There's also sanctions according to the normal customs law in place if false documents are submitted. So there's also a possibility for monetary sanctions there. So it's a whole system that is in place. We have tested it with the import, the sole import that we had so far under the SEPA. So it's really not a lot of experience we have so far. But the system is in place. I think it's not too burdensome for importers. It's just about the question now that whether our importers shift their supply chains to Indonesia in the midterm and actually take up the benefits they could have under the EFTA Indonesia FTA.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting to think, and I mean, what you have said also aligns with what Cameron said, that it's only to assess the implementation, but it's interesting to hear in practice that you have to set up the ordinance, detailing the procedures and how you take into account that it's not too burdensome for importers because they were already familiar. So in the election of the standards, you chose those that were already in place. So some sort of formalization was already happening as well. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Maybe just one element that I forgot, also maybe to echo a bit what Manuel said before, regarding cooperation. I think that's also an important aspect. And part of the implementation of this agreement is, of course, all these procedures at customs upon importation. But the SEPA, so that's what we call the FTA with Indonesia, also has a whole chapter on cooperation. And Switzerland has been active in Indonesia, supporting the sustainable production of commodities, including palm oil, for many years. So I think we continue this. This has also been reinforced now that the FTA has entered into force. So we're also supporting actually this sustainable production on the ground, I think, which is also an important element to make the whole system more credible, not only require compliance by your partner, but also supporting the partner in actually meeting these criteria and improving conditions on the ground. I think that's also something that is part of the implementation package, if you want, of the whole FTA and this whole palm oil solution.
Thank you. Thank you very much for noting that. And I mean, thinking about what these procedures meant also for importers and then for the certification scheme, Cameron, I want to ask you what type of procedures have been set or could be set by VSS to ensure that the integration of them into trade policy does not add a burden to customs officers or private sector actors?
Yeah, it's a good question. To answer that, I can build off what Mario said, that the private sector has led the movement of VSS to begin with. And as he rightfully noted, it was due to the absence of government regulation doing this. It was ironically, thanks for Dominic being here, is actually a Swiss retailer that helped to start the RSPO, realizing that they didn't want to have a negative contribution to the palm oil supply chain. So partnered with WWF, a few other private sector actors to form the RSPO back in 2004. And since then, we've built a lot of very complex systems, name drop to ISEAL, following the codes of good conduct and a lot of the ISEAL practices to make sure that we have a very robust process of assurance that has been changing every 5 years. We review our standards to strengthen it even more. So we have a very complex chain of custody certification that goes through the whole supply chain, already quite a lot of procedures in place. So to reduce the burden for customs officers, this is where recognizing VSS standards, to me, makes a lot of sense. There already are all these checks and balances there. There already are requirements to declare the certification status through documentation every step of the way through the supply chain. So to the point of the Swiss and Indonesia agreement, the segregated and identity preserved supply chain has built into it full traceability to the plantation and guarantee that it's 100% certified following our no deforestation standards, our child labor, forced labor standards as well. So all of that's already built into our system. Not saying any VSS is perfect. Ours certainly has room for continuous improvement, and we're always working towards that. But building VSS in as a foundation for trade agreements is certainly the natural progression, as Mario had mentioned. To me, I don't personally see it as an identity crisis. I see that as what has always been the goal. Kind of speaking from a nonprofit lens, we're always trying to work ourselves out of a job at these kinds of things. Because VSS started out of an absence of government regulation, ultimately we want to build that framework that can eventually become required, and voluntary work will not be needed anymore for the private sector. We've heard a lot of private sector actors say that they welcome this because historically, as Mario noted, they've been doing this work. They're the ones that always have to communicate to all of their upstream suppliers, make sure everybody's on board. When it becomes a requirement, if done the right way, it does help to create that common language, level playing field. So everybody is coming along already automatically, so the private sector doesn't have to carry that burden as much. Neither do the customs officers as well. But an important thing to note, though, is that VSS will always still be something, or at least for a while, something that will be useful in more developing economies. In Europe and now North America as well, we are seeing kind of a natural progression where so many people have been complying to VSS for quite a while that it now is a little bit simpler to make it more of a requirement. The infrastructure, especially in Europe, has been built out for quite a long time. So already just naturally, a vast majority of the palm oil going into most European countries is going to be certified sustainable when you're at least referencing the RSPO. But we still have many other countries that are at the beginning of this process, some of the biggest importers in the world. So VSS is still going to be very important in those areas, especially some of our other supply chains that we certified, not segregated or identity preserved, but referencing things like mass balance. These are still going to be incredibly important, especially when we want to make sure that we're not leaving smallholders and some uncertified actors behind. We want to make sure we find the right mechanisms, the right incentives to bring every actor along with us, ultimately get them certified, or at least following our standards or higher is the ultimate goal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think, yeah, I mean, we keep discussing how VSS have an incredible support role for everyone to comply with emerging regulations, and how the added value of VSS is that you make sure that everybody's included and that there are special mechanisms in place for smallholder producers, especially in developing countries. But I mean, for me, the key word here that it keeps coming is collaboration and cooperation. And just to conclude, I want to come back to Manuel on cooperation, because you mentioned that you actually answered partially my question in the first one about the actual enforcement of these cooperation provisions. And you have said that there is a huge vacuum in this. So I wanted to ask you whether you have any reactions on what we have discussed, but also what mechanisms do you think that could be put in place to encourage actually this cooperation and exchange of information on voluntary sustainability standards between governments?
Thank you, Florencia. Yes, as a brief reaction, I think that we face a challenge here, and the challenge is how well organized are the producers of a certain products. Because, for example, the palm oil industry, even in Colombia, we are very well organized, and they have they have worked almost 10 years ago, since already 10 years, in order to be certified with these different possibilities to make sure that they don't have issues with sustainability. But there are other chains of producers, or other for example, in Colombia, we have a strong coffee producers, but under an union. And those outside of the union are more atomized, are more disaggregated, and they have issues with how to present their sustainability. And then also cacao farmers and so on and so forth. So the problem that we have seen in regarding these VSS when when they use it to comply for international obligations is that it creates a patchwork of VSS in order to be able to prove the full compliance. And that leads me to the answer of your actual and direct question. And I will have to begin by saying that during the presentation, you mentioned that there is a risk that these voluntary standards become mandatory. Well, it is happening. It is happening in the sense that many of the markets, and we just saw it with the palm oil example, but with many others in regard, and I have to say again, I'm sorry, the Green Deal, these voluntary standards became mandatory, maybe indirectly, because they are not asking directly the producer to certify it, but the importer has to do it. So in that sense, it changed the structure from encouraging voluntary sustainability standards towards actually requiring the proofs that the production is sustainable. So in that sense, the implementation will definitely shift its purpose. There will not more encouragement. I think that we already, that train already left the station. But I think that there will be a more, it will be focused more on cooperation, on how this dialogue between the markets, how this dialogue between the governments will strengthen in order to be sure that you can use these VSS that you already have, like palm oil industry, like Rainforest Alliance, as we mentioned, like many others, like, for example, florist. There's a very good one that is called Sustainable Florist that is also very complex and covers many of the boxes of these mandatory regulations. But how can these VSS could be used in order to permit the market access, because will be denied otherwise? Or how we can implement different VSS internally, how that can be certified, how can we prove that to the other market? So definitely the shift there will be a shift between encouragement and cooperation towards cooperation, and that will be how these VSS in the international agreements will be implemented.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuel. And I think that you touch upon something key that we discuss in the insight, that is that there's also, it's not only the difference between countries, but also between sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Some others have been using VSS longer, or there are more VSS in the market. And one of the things that we mentioned in the insight that perhaps it would be useful to have some sectoral dialogues on different commodities to foster more collaboration and start from there, rather than attempting to have a wide perception on this collaboration. So I think, Cameron, you wanted to add just one last thing? Sorry.
Yeah, just building off Manuel, just one quick example that I think, I mean, it's going to sound very American to me to promote this one, but where cooperation I've seen written well into policy is in the U.S. Forest Act, which this is not an endorsement of the U.S. Forest Act. There's still some work to be done, but they have built into the U.S. Forest Act some really good provisions that I know countries like Colombia will greatly benefit from because of a lot of the success and sustainability. But they have built in a trusted trader program where if you can show that you have a good history, good track record of transparency, traceability, and due diligence, that you for a period of time will have a reduced due diligence burden. And it's a good way to build that cooperation, build that trust by just showing that initial capability. And then you get that reduction of due diligence burden going forward. And then you just recertify it after a certain amount of time. Still needs to be set what that time will be. And they also have government procurement preferences as well. That'll just allow for contracts to be rewarded to those who are able to show these higher levels of sustainability and traceability. Again, building that partnership and trust with the importers, with the producers, with the partner countries. Building on that within these policies, I think, is incredibly important. Something I do think the U.S. Forest Act has done a very great job with, and something I think could be an example to be followed for other countries as well.
Thank you, Cameron, for bringing that up. And this is precisely why we bring different expertise to hear more about these examples and make them known. So I'm gonna thank you very much for all your remarks. I think that we have had really interesting remarks. I'm gonna hand over to Alice, and we're gonna turn into the next part on next steps and way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Flor. So I'm Alice Tipping. I'm the Director of the Trade Policy Work at ISD. We now have only a very short amount of time for this last part of the discussion, about 10 minutes if I'm to promise to give the floor back to Joshua for some closing remarks. But let me pick up on a point that, that a couple of people have already made about the shift in the role of voluntary sustainability standards from being one of differentiation to being one essentially of market access, because that, I think, suggests a very different set of questions for policymakers and also a very different set of questions for international policy cooperation between governments, which is what we're about to talk about now. So I'm going to bring in a couple of people from different multilateral forums to get their perspective on international cooperation. So we have Laura Locks, who is a legal counselor on technical barriers to trade at the Trade and Environment Division at the WTO Secretariat. And we have Ms. Sol Lee, who works with the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, which, as everyone in this audience probably knows, is an initiative among 6 UN organizations: the FAO, the International Trade Center, UN Environment Programme, the UN Economic Cooperation in Europe, UNIDO, and the UN Trade and Development, formerly UNCTAD, but UN Trade and Development as of now. So I'm going to ask them a couple of different questions about how their multilateral forums can serve to craft, I think, some of the international cooperation between governments that is now becoming more and more necessary as VSS become part of trade policy. So Laura, perhaps I'll start with you. Can you give us just very briefly a sense of how the role of the WTO might, or what the role of the WTO could be, and the work the WTO has already done in a multilateral discussion about voluntary sustainability standards in FTAs, but also in trade policy more generally? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, everybody. I will try to be as brief as possible, but I also share some useful information to you. I think there are many aspects of the WTO contribution in this discussion, but I will perhaps limit my remarks on my area of comfort, which is the technical barriers to trade agreement, but which I think that we all agree that many of the issues discussed today related to VSS either relate to TBT measures, standards, regulations, or are about those measures. So let me just say, share with you a few thoughts here. I think it was quite interesting that Florencia and Manuel mentioned cooperation and emerging issues, because just recently in the MC13, our ministerial conference, for the first time we had a ministerial declaration on regulatory cooperation on technical barriers to trade. And you will see if you read that document that members very clearly spell out their priorities in this regard. And in that sense, they say that they wanted to confirm the need of work in immediate and emerging challenges, including climate change and sustainable development. And I think, so you can see from that declaration, it's not only words, but I think it's a desire for members to focus, at least in the TBT area, on these themes. And indeed, we are undergoing this year, hoping to complete in November, our 10th triennial review. This is where members pose lots of proposals on new emerging themes they want to be part of the agenda of the committee for the next 3 years. And I'm just going to give you a few examples so you can see that where members, it can confirm that members are indeed concerned and interested in this topic. Those are only proposals, doesn't mean that by November those proposals will be adopted. But I think normally many are in this triennial review. So there is one proposal from the United States, for example. Those are public documents for the members to discuss traceability in certification in terms of sustainable agriculture. There is another proposal from the United States which may seem not related to sustainability, but you will see that it is also from the United States to discuss international standards on critical emerging technologies, and they list a couple of those, and one is biotechnology and biofuels standards, which may have impact on sustainable development. There is another proposal from Australia, which I think is quite interesting because also relates to this idea of coherence. I think in this area of sustainability and standards, there's a lot of different processes going on at the same time. And I think in the WTO, because those are cross-cutting issues, we have this issue being discussed in different committees. So the Australian proposal is for the TBT committee to coordinate better with other committees in the WTO that deals with similar issues, including one, the Committee on Trade and Environment, with respect of environmental standards, but also, interestingly, the Committee on Government Procurement, including to discuss technical specifications for green procurement and sustainable green procurement. So there's another linkage there. And then finally, another proposal from the United States to discuss what they called food contact packages, including in terms of international standards and specifications that may affect food sustainability. The committee has been already discussed last year's issues on plastics and climate change. Now, if I may, just one more minute to just share other information. I think that since we've been discussing on VSS under regional trade agreements, and although sustainability, okay, maybe there is a new momentum in the committee now, but we have this transparency provision in the TBT agreement for members to notify regional trade agreements that relate to, not necessarily only about, standards, regulations, certification. And in that context, if you look at in our database, there have been actually a couple of many notifications on mutual recognition and equivalence agreements, including by Switzerland, for example, and in the United States on labeling on organic labeling and packaging, etc. And in the organic area, actually, there's maybe 10 or 15 agreements being notified. So I think that more transparency in regional agreements dealing with this topic could be also useful, because it's an opportunity for members, other members thinking, or other private sector, because we have our database called the ePing on TBT measure notifications, to learn more about this in the details. And finally, since I think Joshua mentioned in the beginning the 6 principles, I think there is also a lot of inspiration that could be useful for VSS, be it as a technical barriers to trade, be it as something similar but different from the 6 principles, which are these principles that relate to international standards in terms of effectiveness, transparency, openness. But I just want to focus on one, perhaps 2, perhaps important principles that could be useful for this discussion. One is—
that'll be very quick.
Yeah, very quick.
Yep.
It's on coherence, which is the idea that you have, you cannot have 10 different international standards dealing with the same topic. They should be complementary and not contradictory. But another one is in the development dimension, in the sense that I think the specifications in international standards, including sustainability, the participation from the society, from developing countries, is very important. Otherwise, those documents will not be useful. And my final remark is just to say that recently we adopted in the committee very detailed guidelines on conformity assessment, which I think, since we discussed now certification, the devil is in the detail. It could be a useful guidance as you really ensure that those VSS, as implemented, as enforced, they are done in a way that is effective, but also don't proportionally don't affect trade disproportionately. So sorry that I have advanced my time, but I think there was—
Not at all. Thanks, Lauro. Super helpful. I mean, so the 6 principles: coherence and development as a key focus, transparency, and I think we'll be following the triennial review of this TBT agreement rather more closely now as we see how some of these discussions evolve. Sol, could I turn to you? You've been extremely patient. Could you talk to us a little bit, perhaps, about, from your UNFSS perspective, how you think governments and voluntary standards could collaborate to overcome some of the challenges that have been discussed? And if you look back at the the Easy Retro board, and I'd encourage everyone to do that before we sign off. There's credibility as an issue, standardization, cost and lack of capacity, a lack of consumer demand, and price incentives. So in the last few minutes, can you talk to us a little bit about some collaboration opportunities you see? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm also a big congratulations on your brilliant work, building on the UNFSS 2020 report, which was also about VSS adoption. So I'm really glad to see this long-term research and coordinated effort of the community of VSS. From the UNFSS perspective, collaboration is indeed very important. Many guest speakers already mentioned that we have several governments across the countries, and there are various VSS organizations. And also at the end, we're talking about the businesses, so who has to change their agricultural practices and the production processes. And I mean, also there are several sectors, and per sectors there are several VSS. So there are so many stakeholders that are involved in each part of this beautiful ecosystem. I think the guest speaker mentioned the patchwork. I think that's the best way of describe this system. And the collaboration, I mean, really should take place taking this into account, should be based on the multi-stakeholders. And it should be able to cover the whole approach of FTA from the design, implementation, and monitoring. UNFS tries to set up a mechanism to facilitate this collaboration, which can continue and include as many stakeholders as possible. I mean, I think the very first step is to have people together at one place so that they can talk about various topics as mentioned in Easy Retro. So for example, we are supporting VSS national multi-stakeholder platforms that exist in various countries, including India, China, and Indonesia as well in this case. So it includes private sectors, government officers, and not only just standard bodies, but also agriculture and trade, because indeed there is also issue of legalizing VSS as a part of the mandatory requirement. They are working on exchange of information, review best practices, and also conduct assessments and capacity building. Also, another collaboration is between the countries, policy dialogues, bringing, because some of the businesses are multinationals, having a long value chains, and also VSS organizations sometimes have activities across multiple countries. So we are supporting this international dialogue through the International Convention on Sustainable Trade and Standards, bringing various VSS practitioners and government officials together in one place for the sake of information exchange.
That's fantastic. Very interesting indeed. And really interesting to see that some of this collaboration that we've been talking about is actually already happening, right? So an interesting platform to be able to build on as we see this shift in the role that VSS play in trade policy. Right, we have 3 minutes. Joshua, I'm happy to hand the floor over to you for closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're really seeing a sea change from talking about if this is possible to seeing that sustainable trade and the use of voluntary sustainability standards is possible and how we operationalize this. We've focused a lot on now the potential for collaboration and next steps. One thing I'd like to highlight is ISEAL and IISD will host an in-person workshop in Geneva, date TBD, to discuss next steps and how we can further operationalize. Thank you so much for all of your comments in the Easy Retro, from the challenges to the opportunities. Our panelists have addressed most of these issues, and others we've just scratched the surface on. And thanks also for all of your questions. We've answered a lot of them either through the dialogue or in the conversation today or in the chat window. Another thing I wanted to highlight is please fill out the survey. We've placed the link in the chat. I don't know if we could get the slides also. I wanted to highlight that ISEAL is hosting our Global Sustainability Symposium in Switzerland next month. You can register for the ISEAL Symposium using that QR code or the link. We'll be exploring mandatory corporate sustainability due diligence, green claims, effective reporting, how we can strengthen partnerships for action. So the trade policy agenda will also be an important part of the discussion. And one final thing I wanted to highlight was that ISEAL believes, and we've seen, that credible sustainability standards can come from anywhere. I see our Colombian colleague has dropped off, but I wanted to just highlight 2 Colombian examples. One in the mining sector, the Alliance for Responsible Mining focuses on artisanal mining, and that's developed from Colombia. Flor Verde, a certification for flowers, has also come from Colombia. So like our colleague from the Colombian Ministry of Trade said, it's not that it's a risk of the voluntary becoming a reality, it's that that is the reality. So these voluntary mechanisms are springing up from everywhere. And now it's a matter of the coherence and the transparency and the coordination to achieve the sustainable development outcomes that we all want to see, and that we sometimes forget are at the very heart of why the WTO and the UN were formed. So we can get lost in the details of, is this a technical barrier to trade, or is it a non-product requirement? But if we go back to the founding principles of the TBT agreement and others, it all boils down to sustainable development. So, and the policy objectives that we want to achieve. So thank you again to IISD and all of our panelists. And we look forward to exploring next steps with you and hopefully seeing many of you in Geneva. Thanks so much.